Jane Fonda once said she was always in love with Robert Redford, but after his tragic death at 89, she finally explained what she meant. And then came the line about Redford that nobody was ready for. Robert Redford's passing marked more than the loss of an actor. It felt like the closing of a chapter in Hollywood's long, complicated story, the end of an era when stars weren't just celebrities, but symbols of ideals larger than life. Tributes poured in from across the industry. Directors, co-stars, and fans remembered his charm, his talent, and his stubborn independence. But among all the voices, one stood apart: Jane Fonda. Because for over 5 decades, she wasn't just his co-star. She was the only one who lived both sides of the myth: the Redford the world adored and the man behind the screen. And when Jane finally spoke, her words weren't just a goodbye. They reshaped the story of their bond. A bond built on chemistry, friction, admiration, and a love that never played out the way audiences imagined. Robert Redford's journey didn't begin with Hollywood glamour. He grew up in Santa Monica during the Depression, a restless boy who found escape in sports and drawing. But his early life wasn't without shadows. He lost his mother when he was just a teenager, and the grief left a mark that never quite faded. Restless and rebellious, he drank too much, dropped out of college, and drifted through Europe with a sketchbook, unsure of where he belonged. Yet somehow, out of failure and wandering, he forged himself into something new. By the mid-1960s, he was everywhere. First a stage presence on Broadway, then a movie star. Films like Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, The Sting, and The Way We Were didn't just make him famous, they made him the emblem of rugged American charisma. To audiences, he was untouchable, the golden boy of a turbulent age. Jane Fonda's rise was equally dramatic, but cut from the opposite cloth. She was born into Hollywood royalty as the daughter of Henry Fonda, but privilege never shielded her from turmoil. Determined to break free of her father's shadow, she carried her own storms: insecurity, a complicated family legacy, and a fire for justice that couldn't be contained. While Redford cultivated privacy, Fonda embraced confrontation, speaking out on civil rights, feminism, and the Vietnam War. By the late 1960s, their paths collided. He was the all-American symbol, careful and reserved. She was the outspoken rebel, fearless in a divided nation, and together they became something Hollywood hadn't seen before. Two icons who represented opposite sides of a cultural war, yet shared a spark that felt undeniable. Hollywood quickly decided they weren't just co-stars, they were America's golden pair. But Jane's real feelings for Redford ran far deeper than the magazines ever guessed. When Robert Redford and Jane Fonda stepped onto a New York stage together in Barefoot in the Park, 1963, the spark was immediate. At first, it was just another Broadway comedy, Neil Simon's witty script about a young couple fumbling through marriage. But the way Redford and Fonda played it, audiences swore they were watching something more. 4 years later, the play became a film, and the myth took off. In Barefoot in the Park, 1967, Redford was the buttoned-up lawyer, Fonda the free-spirited wife. The chemistry was effortless, too effortless. Viewers walked out of theaters convinced the romance was real. Even critics hinted that the line between acting and intimacy had blurred. Hollywood, never one to miss an opportunity, leaned all the way in. They branded the pair the American couple. Glossy magazines ran spreads of them laughing between takes, trading smiles that seemed just a little too natural. On screen, they were perfection. Off-screen, the world imagined they must have been just as inseparable. But the truth was far messier. Behind the bright images, the differences were stark. Jane was the activist who ran headlong into controversy, chaining herself to causes that made headlines. Redford was the golden boy who built walls around his privacy, guarding his reputation at all costs. Their connection was real, but not in the way Hollywood was selling it. And Jane knew it. Years later, she'd reveal a detail so disarming, so strangely ordinary, that it cracked the glossy surface of the myth. But then came the line about Redford no one was ready for. For decades, fans had argued about what lay behind their chemistry. Was it romance? Was it rivalry? Or was it something the cameras never captured? Jane kept her answer tucked away, until she finally decided to tell the truth. That one line would change how audiences remembered him, and how they understood her feelings for him. When Jane finally pulled back the curtain, the truth wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even dramatic. It was painfully human. At Cannes, during a candid interview in 2023, she admitted with a wry laugh, "He didn't like to kiss. He was always in a bad mood." The words landed like a thunderclap. For audiences who had spent decades imagining Redford as Hollywood's dream man, the rugged heartthrob, the perfect romantic partner, Jane's honesty seemed almost too ordinary, too jarring. It stripped away the fantasy that had been built up through magazine covers and decades of movie posters. And yet, it was this very ordinariness that made it powerful. For years, fans had projected their fantasies onto the golden boy of Hollywood. They saw the chemistry in Barefoot in the park or the Electric Horseman and assumed it must be real. But Jane's confession revealed something else entirely. Redford wasn't the reckless charmer people imagined. He was guarded, careful, always protecting his image, even in moments meant to look intimate. Jane never spoke those words as cruelty. She said them with affection, even humor. It was her way of saying that Redford was not a fantasy, but a man. A man who, despite all his charm, kept parts of himself sealed away. The world saw the perfect kiss on screen. She saw the reality behind it. And Jane wasn't the only one. Barbra Streisand once admitted she had to beg Redford to even take The Way We Were seriously. She called him charismatic but distant, unwilling to let go of control. Meryl Streep, who starred with him in Out of Africa, described him as magnetic but also deeply private, a listener more than a sharer. Again and again, his leading ladies told the same story. On screen, he gave everything. Off screen, he gave almost nothing. That was Redford's paradox. He built his career on intimacy, close-ups that lingered, love stories that felt raw, but he lived his life at arm's length. To him, privacy wasn't just a preference, it was survival. And in Jane's confession, you can hear both the frustration and the admiration that came from knowing him better than most. For fans, the revelation was disorienting. How could the man who gave the world some of cinema's most passionate moments have disliked something as simple, as natural, as a kiss? But that was the myth cracking open. Hollywood had painted Redford as a fantasy. Jane painted him as a man, and in doing so, she reshaped his legend. Her confession wasn't meant to diminish him. If anything, it made him more real. The golden boy had flaws. He had moods. He had walls so high that even Jane, who adored him, couldn't always climb over them. But then came her second confession, the one that reframed everything she'd ever said about him. Because after breaking down the myth, Jane revealed the truth about her own heart, and it was a truth that no one was ready for. If Jane's first confession stripped away the myth, her second one turned the story upside down. In interview after interview, she admitted, "I was always in love with him." On the surface, it sounded like the bombshell everyone had waited for. After decades of speculation, did they or didn't they? Here was Jane confirming what fans had suspected all along. But then came the twist. She didn't mean it in the way people imagined. Jane wasn't confessing to some secret affair. She wasn't revealing that the chemistry on screen had spilled into a hidden romance. What she meant was something far more complicated and far more enduring. For Jane, being in love with Robert Redford didn't mean being lovers. It meant admiration, respect, and an emotional tether that survived marriages, divorces, politics, and decades of Hollywood chaos. She carried him with her not as a partner, but as a constant, the man who was always there, even when they were apart. It was a truth that unsettled fans almost more than the kissing remark, because it asked a harder question. What if Hollywood's greatest love story wasn't really about romance at all? What if it was about devotion that never turned into the relationship people assumed? The irony was that timing had always been against them. When they first worked together in the 1960s, both were married. Jane to director Roger Vadim, Redford to historian Lola Van Wagenen. Later, when those marriages ended, the timing was still off. Jane's life became consumed by activism and controversy, while Redford clung tightly to his privacy. They moved in parallel, close enough to touch but never quite meeting in the middle. Jane once reflected that she sometimes blamed herself for his moods. That sense of guilt revealed just how deep her feelings ran. It wasn't romantic obsession, but a kind of loyalty that can weigh heavier than love. She didn't just care for him as a colleague, she internalized his storms as if they were her own. This is why her confession resonated so strongly. Always in Love didn't describe a fleeting crush. It described a lifetime of connection, never consummated, but never broken. In a town where passion usually burned fast and disappeared even faster, Jane's quiet, complicated devotion stood out. Fans couldn't help but play the what-if game. What if Jane and Robert had met at different times? What if one of them had been willing to let go of control, to take the risk of turning chemistry into reality? Would Hollywood's greatest unrealized romance have become its greatest actual one? Or would it have burned out under the same pressures that claim so many other legendary couples? Jane never answered that question directly, perhaps because she didn't need to. To her, the relationship they had, the work, the friendship, the unspoken tether, was enough. Maybe even more than enough, because it lasted. On screen, they were lovers the world adored. Off screen, they were something harder to define but impossible to dismiss. Jane's confession reframed their story not as a missed love affair, but as proof that connection can be deeper than romance. And that was what made their decades-long work-wife dynamic even more fascinating. If their bond wasn't defined by romance, it was defined by something just as enduring: work. Few Hollywood pairs ever managed what Robert Redford and Jane Fonda did. 5 films, 5 decades, and a connection that survived every shift in their careers. It started before the myth of Barefoot in the Park even hit theaters. In The Chase, 1966, directed by Arthur Penn and starring Marlon Brando, Redford and Fonda were part of an ensemble cast that tried to capture the chaos of small-town America. They weren't the stars of that film, but their chemistry was already undeniable. Even in limited scenes, you could feel the spark, a preview of what was to come. Then came Barefoot in the Park, 1967, the film that made them Hollywood's golden couple. But instead of letting it end there, they kept returning to each other. In 1979, they reunited in The Electric Horseman, a movie that blended their on-screen charm with their off-screen contradictions. Jane was playing an ambitious television reporter. Redford was a cowboy disillusioned with fame. The film mirrored their own differences, Jane's fire and political edge crashing into Redford's guarded reserve. It was during this period that Jane confessed she sometimes blamed herself for his moods. She admitted she'd worry that his distance or his bad days were somehow her fault, a strikingly vulnerable confession for someone who was usually unflinchingly outspoken. That detail revealed more than she may have intended. Jane wasn't just working with Robert. She was tethered to him emotionally, measuring her own feelings against his silences. Through the years, their differences only made their bond stronger. Redford was meticulous, sometimes moody, always protective of his image. Jane was impulsive, fiery, a lightning rod for controversy. Together, they balanced each other out. On set, she pushed. He steadied. She provoked. He withheld. It was a rhythm that, to audiences, read as passion. To them, it was simply who they were. Their final on-screen collaboration before their long gap came with The Electric Horseman. By then, the myth of their chemistry had become bigger than either of them. Audiences went to theaters not just for the story, but to see Redford and Fonda together again. Hollywood had plenty of on-screen couples, but few had this kind of staying power. And then, for decades, nothing. Both moved on to other projects. Redford dove deeper into directing, building the Sundance Institute into a cultural force. Fonda entered one of the most controversial periods of her career, becoming a lightning rod during the Vietnam War era and beyond. Yet even as their careers diverged, the myth of their connection lingered. That was the unique power of their partnership. It wasn't defined by frequency, but by impact. Every time they reunited, the world paid attention. Every glance, every scene was loaded with decades of history. They didn't need to be a couple to feel inseparable. For fans, this work-wife dynamic became its own kind of love story, one that spanned half a century without ever needing a wedding or a kiss behind the curtain. And when they finally reunited after decades apart, the world was reminded that their story wasn't over yet. By the time Robert Redford and Jane Fonda reunited on screen in 2017, 50 years had passed since Barefoot in the Park made them Hollywood's golden pair. Half a century. Careers had soared, marriages had ended, scandals had erupted, and Hollywood itself had changed almost beyond recognition. But when the Netflix film Our Souls at Night premiered, it felt like nothing had changed at all. The movie wasn't a blockbuster, nor was it meant to be. It was a quiet story about 2 widowed neighbors who find companionship late in life. But the weight it carried went far beyond its script. For audiences who had grown up watching Redford and Fonda as young lovers fumbling through marriage, seeing them together again, older, weathered, but still magnetic, was almost overwhelming. Jane herself described the experience with a mixture of awe and relief. "It was like no time had passed," she said in interviews. After decades of playing opposite each other, the rhythms of their performances still fit like a glove. The pauses, the glances, the timing. It was all still there, untouched by the years. But what struck audiences most wasn't the nostalgia, it was the honesty. For once, the fantasy of Hollywood's golden couple gave way to something richer, two people who had aged, who carried scars, but who still found intimacy in each other's presence. Watching them share scenes in Our Souls at Night wasn't about reliving the past, it was about confronting time itself and realizing that connection can survive it. In one scene, the two lie in bed, simply talking. There are no grand gestures, no sweeping declarations, just quiet conversation. But the subtext was undeniable. This wasn't just Louis and Addie, the characters they played. It was Robert and Jane. 5 decades of shared history spilling into the silence between their lines. Critics praised the film not only as a touching drama, but as a living archive of their chemistry. The New York Times noted that watching them together was like watching time collapse. Their youth, their middle years, and their old age all existed at once, bound together by the same spark that had fooled audiences in 1967. For Jane, the reunion wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. She admitted that working with Redford again reminded her of the love she had carried for him all those years, the respect, the admiration, the tether that never broke. But now, with both of them older and freer from Hollywood's expectations, she could finally see it for what it was. A lifelong bond, never defined by romance but never diminished by its absence. The reunion also allowed audiences to reflect on their own lives. Viewers who had seen Barefoot in the park as teenagers were now in their 70s, grappling with the same questions the film asked. What does love mean when the years pile up? What do you carry with you when so much has been lost? Our Souls at Night wasn't just a movie, it was a conversation between two legends and their audience. And it was proof that even after decades apart, Redford and Fonda could still create magic together. But as moving as their reunion was, he left a mark on every woman who worked beside him. And when the tributes began, Jane's voice was the one everyone was waiting for. When news of Robert Redford's death broke, Hollywood responded instantly. Directors, co-stars, and fans shared memories of his charisma and intensity. Meryl Streep recalled the river scene from Out of Africa, how his quiet presence made her feel like the whole world had stilled. Demi Moore spoke of the unforgettable weight of filming Indecent Proposal. Michelle Pfeiffer called him a true friend, mourning not just the actor, but the man who made even the toughest scenes feel alive. These were heartfelt words from some of Hollywood's most celebrated women. But none carried the gravity of Jane Fonda's. For over 50 years, she had been his mirror, his foil, his sparring partner, his confidant. Everyone knew her voice would be the one that mattered most. When she finally spoke, her words weren't dramatic. They were quiet, almost simple. She called Redford charismatic, intelligent, intense. A man who could frustrate her, move her, and inspire her, often all in the same day. She remembered the small things, the way their differences made every collaboration both a clash and a thrill, how working with him was like no time had passed, even after decades apart. And then came the part that reshaped everything, the line that once seemed to strip away the myth. He didn't like to kiss, he was always in a bad mood. Now read like something else entirely. Not a complaint, not gossip, but an intimacy only someone who truly knew him could voice. It was her way of saying, I saw him, I knew him, and I loved him anyway. Fans who had spent decades asking if the chemistry between them was real, suddenly had their answer. Not in scandal, not in romance, but in something deeper. Respect, admiration, the kind of love that doesn't fade, even when it's never named. For Jane, breaking her silence wasn't just about honoring Redford's death. It was about closing a circle, a bond that had spanned half a century, tested by time, strengthened by truth, and now remembered with grace. In the end, Robert Redford's legend was never in doubt. He will always be remembered as the golden boy of American cinema, the myth Hollywood built from his face, his voice, his unshakable presence. But Jane Fonda's words peeled back that surface and revealed something rarer. Behind the myth was a man who could frustrate her, challenge her, and still carry her quiet love across half a century. Her farewell was not gossip, it was not fantasy, it was something stronger: respect, devotion, and truth. And that, more than anything else, was what he deserved. Robert Redford will live forever in the films, the myths will endure. But because of Jane, we can also remember him not just as a star, but as a man, complicated, guarded, admired, and deeply loved. And in the quiet echo of her words, his story feels heavier, truer, and more eternal than any role he ever played.